Hey guys, as a continuation from the last video, we're going to be talking about certain shifts in aggregate demand and why they occur. Well, as we talked about in the last video, we know that aggregate demand is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And the aggregate demand curve can shift either to the right if it's an increase in aggregate demand, so it can shift to the right, or it can shift to the left, which is a decrease in aggregate demand, which I can draw, I guess, in red or white, and it can shift to the left. All right, so aggregate demand can shift to the right if it's an increase, and to the left if it's a decrease. So what dictates that shift? Well, what dictates that shift is exactly what aggregate demand is made up of. All right, so we're going to be talking about all the scenarios that they could possibly ask you when it comes to shifting aggregate demand. So the first thing they can ask you is, let's say that the income of people in the economy as a whole increases. So if income increases, you have to think about it. Let's say my income increases. All right. If my income increases, then I would probably want to spend more money on consumption. Maybe I want to buy an extra pair of shoes. Maybe I want to buy more clothes. Maybe I want to go out for dinner a little bit more. So if my income increases, then I'll want to spend more money on certain other things, whether it be essential or not essential. So if my income increases, then my consumption will also increase. And if my consumption also increases, that means my aggregate demand must also increase. This means that my aggregate demand will shift to the right, which I'll say right here as right. And that's because consumption here is increasing, so my aggregate demand as a whole will also increase, so it will shift to the right. Same thing if your income decreases. If your income decreases, then you'll be a lot more conservative with your money. So you won't consume as much. You won't buy that extra pair of pants. You won't go out to dinner as much. So if your consumption decreases, your aggregate demand will also decrease. And that means that you'll shift your aggregate demand to the left. Okay? So that's income increase and decrease. Now, let's say that the government puts an income tax, let's say. If they put an income tax on you, for the same reason, your consumption will start to decrease. So why does your consumption start to decrease? Well, that's because out of a portion of whatever income you're getting, you have to pay whatever amount to the government. And if you have to give away some money to the government, then you won't be consuming as much. And if you are not consuming as much, your aggregate demand will be decreasing. And if your aggregate demand is decreasing, it will shift to the left. So this taxes example is also very similar to, let's say, if your income goes down, because taxes is a reason why your income might go down. So if your taxes are increasing, if the government puts higher taxes on your income, then you're going to consume less because you're going to be having less money to spend. And if you consume less, your aggregate demand will be going down, and that will shift your aggregate demand curve to the left. Now, for 3, defense spending. Let's say that the government wants to spend more money on defense, okay? If they want to spend more money on defense, we know that it'll be affecting our government spending part of our aggregate demand curve. So our government spending will be increasing because the government wants to spend more on defense. And if our government spending increases, our aggregate demand will increase. I don't know why I put an addition sign here, comma. Our aggregate demand will increase, and that will shift our aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay? Now, interest rates. Okay, so if your interest rates are increasing, that means that people won't want to invest as much because they have to pay such a high interest rate already with the amount that they have to pay back. So let's say if you loaned out $1,000, okay? Let's say you had to borrow $1,000 and your interest rate was 1% at that time. So in 2001, if you borrowed $1,000, your interest rate was 1%. Now in 2017, if you borrow $1,000, then your interest rate is 5%. Well, in 2017, you won't take out that many more, you won't take loans out because your interest rate has increased so much. Not only do you have to pay this $1,000, but you also have to pay that interest rate of 5%, which is very, very high. So if interest rates are going up, then people won't want to invest as much. So your investments will be going down. And if people don't want to invest as much because the interest rates are so high and they don't want to take out those loans anymore from the banks, if their investments go down, then their aggregate demand will also go down. And if their aggregate demand goes down, we will be shifting the curve to the left. Same reason, if interest rates go down, let's say that interest rates go down, then people will want to invest more money. And if people invest more money, our aggregate demand will increase and we'll shift it to the right. So it's just the exact opposite if our interest rates went down. Same thing for number 3. If the government spending decreased, then we would shift our aggregate demand to the left because our government spending would decrease, our aggregate demand would decrease, and we would shift it to the left. Now, number 5 is kind of confusing for a lot of people, including myself. So appreciation is essentially when your dollar value, let's say the dollar in the United States has more value than the rupee in India, okay? So if the dollar value, if the value of your money is increasing, a lot of foreign nations, and this goes into our foreign trade effect that we talked about in the previous video, but let's say the value of your dollar has increased, okay, comparative to other currencies. If that has happened, then not a lot of people will want to buy from you. So your exports will decrease, okay? Because the value of your money has increased so much that, let's say, a country like India can't keep up with that valuation. So they don't want to buy that many goods from you anymore. So your exports domestically, that means if the United States was trading from India and the value of the US dollar has increased, India won't buy as much. So the United States can't export a lot of its goods. So our exports domestically will decrease, and if our exports decrease, then that means our net exports will decrease, and because net exports is exports minus imports, so if exports are decreasing, our net exports as a whole will decrease, and if our net exports decreases, our aggregate demand will decrease, and if our aggregate demand decreases, then we will shift our aggregate demand curve to the left. Okay, and same thing if you have depreciation. If your dollar value has decreased and the Indian rupee has stayed the same, then the India would want to buy more of your goods, and if India wants to buy more of your goods, your exports would increase, and your net exports would increase, your aggregate demand would increase, and you would shift it to the right. So depreciation would be the exact opposite of appreciation. So depreciation would lead to a rightward shift, while appreciation would lead to a leftward shift. And all 5 of these pretty much cover all the possible questions they can ask you when it comes to the shift in aggregate demand. I hope this makes sense, and a good way to remember all of this is just by this formula. Whatever context they give you, just compare it to this formula, see what part of this formula does it affect. Does it affect consumption, investment, government spending, net exports? How does it affect it? And depending on how it affects it, we can see how it affects aggregate demand as a whole. I hope this video has been informative, and I hope you tune in for more. Thank you.